Hey everybody, it's EJ from Eyedesyn.com, and today we're going to be talking all about how you can use objects of any kind, as a light source. So I did this little sample render here of it's just a letter. So I used some Motex and some wrapped cylinders along a spline with some spline wrap, and this whole scene is lit by a single spline. So it's really cool. It's very flexible kind of thing. You can really have a lot of fun with it and really explore and get creative with this concept of using any kind of object as a light source and getting some really cool reflections and really cool effects with this method. So let me break down how you can use objects as lights. So let's just do a whole new scene here, and let's try to rebuild that scene. So we had that letter N. Let's go ahead and grab a Motex, and I just chose the letter N because the N looks cool, and let's make that in the middle. Let's choose a cool font like this HWT geometric because it's got these cool little appendages on them. Make it a little bit bigger, make this a little bit deeper. And just to have some nice rounding, we'll do some fillet caps. Boom, boom, boom. And there we go. And let's texture this guy, just so we have something to some kind of cool texture to cast some light onto. So let's make this dark, just so I want the light that's going to be in the scene to kind of light everything, and so everything's going to look fairly dark. And then for the reflectance, we'll just add just a little bit of specular here, and we'll just start right there. I'm going to go into interactive render region just so we can see what everything is looking like, and I'll crank up the quality by moving that arrow up. So now we have live feedback with whatever we're doing here. So first, let's apply our fancy smanchy texture. This will be the text texture. And so like I said, we can use objects as a light source. So really what we could do is just kind of duplicate this piece of text. We'll make it editable, and let's say we wanted to just have one of the caps. So say the front cap or the back cap here. Let's get this cap, this front cap right here. Let's say we want to use that front cap, boom, right there as a light source. I'm going to move it just a little bit in front of our N, and there it is. There's going to be our light source. And to use lights as objects, we actually need to bring in a light first. And the type of light that works for this effect is an area light. And you can see with our area light, if we go into our details, we're going to have this area shape. So by default, we all know that the default area shape is this rectangle that you can then adjust the size and all that good stuff. But if we go into our area shape options, we have this drop down with all of these kind of options here. So you can, use a sphere instead, or, whatever, a line even, or you can use an object or a spline as your light source. And this is exactly what we're going to be doing to do these all kind of cool lighting effects and stuff like that. So the first thing to keep in mind as far as using objects or splines with the area light is that it needs to be an editable object. So we can't just go ahead and say drag and drop this Motex object into this object field. It's got to be a editable piece of geometry. So I can place in this that front face of that N, put it in there, and let's get a floor so we can actually see the light, right? And turn back on interactive render region, and you'll see that we have a light source that is basically the face of this N. So we can go into this details tab here, and let's go over all of the options here. So first thing you'll realize is that while this object's a light, we don't actually see it in our render. To change that, we can just say show and render, and boom, we're going to have our letter N in there. We can put a texture on that, and it's really not going to change anything because it's going by the luminance of that light. So we have 100% intensity there, and if we adjust this, you can see that it's then adjusting everything else. That's really, really bright. But we can then change the color here, and now we have the front face of our N as, you know, casting this nice reddish light, so we can get this kind of pinkish or whatever. Let's apply a texture to the floor, maybe add some reflectance here, and we'll just make this additive so we can actually see the reflection there. There we go. Cool. And go into our light again, go into our details, and you'll notice why we don't have anything in a reflection. That's because we also need to say show this light source in the reflection. Boom, there it is. So we can go in here and say, like, you know, up the roughness here if we want to, but just for sake of a tutorial, I'm not going to slow down my render by doing anything like that. But basically you can see that, you know, this kind of opens up a whole bunch of possibilities here. So let's just go ahead and let's not show that in render, but we can you know, then move this around, and this is now going to be our light source. So, you know, we can now get even more creative with this and say, let's use like a torus as our light source. So now remember, we need to make this editable. Let's go and throw our torus in this object field. And now we basically have like a ring light, which is really cool. And you see in, you know, a lot of actual real photography these days is this really cool ring light. So let's just kind of position this back. And now we got this really cool ring light with some cool reflections and stuff like that. And if we this is kind of going for the same kind of composition that I had, that I showed from the get-go, where I had this nice little snaky wrapped thing going around this letter, the letter N, and kind of lighting the light source. That's kind of what's going on here. So let's actually rebuild that. So again, not only can you use objects, but you can also use splines. So let's go ahead and let's rebuild. Let me go into a different shading mode so we can actually see stuff. Do quick shading, cool. So let's rebuild that little spline. So let's go ahead and quickly get our pen tool, and we'll just kind of make a little wrappy kind of thing. And then we'll kind of position this so it goes in between the letter N, and it's going to be the thing that's going to be lighting the letter. We can get some really cool light effects. And basically what this whole method of using an object as a light source is basically doing is almost acting as some global illumination. So, you know, typically if you wanted an object to, you know, emit light, you would go into its luminance channel and start cranking everything up. And I know there's plenty of tutorials out there for how to do that and use luminance, and you turn on GI and that activates that object's luminance to cast on other objects. But the render hit is very significant. So this is like a fast way to kind of fake global illumination without actually needing to do global illumination at all. So let's want to make sure that this spline kind of goes underneath the N, Let's just move this back like so. So we got the spline going underneath, which is what I want. Move this up. So I want to go right in between, get into the nooks and crannies of this letter. And move this up right here. I want it to light the top part of this. And round this stuff out here. And then we'll have this spline come right back around this side again. And let's just make this a little bit closer. So this is our light source. This also is going to be the spline that we can then wrap some cylinders around, just like we did, just like I did with this reference image right here. So let's go ahead and create a whole bunch of let's do capsules instead this time. So I'm going to make a bunch of capsules and make them tall enough, and maybe bring the radius down a little bit. And what I'm going to do is group a few of these together. I'm just going to duplicate some capsules and make some thick, some skinny. Just kind of move them. I want to clump them all together, kind of like a bunch of cables or something like that. All right, so we got a group of capsules here. And since they're all grouped together, I'll just rename this capsules. And what I can do to then use spline wrap on all of these is to go ahead and grab a spline wrap, place it in the same hierarchy level as all the other capsules. And if I select this spline and just kind of play around with the axis, there we go. So the axis is correct now. Now you can see we have these capsules wrapped around our spline. So we actually first need to go ahead and add more height segments to smooth everything out. Cool, and we can go in here and adjust the size of this stuff by adjusting this spline curve on our spline wrap. You can add a point in here and just kind of, I want it to be thick here and kind of small at the beginning and the end. Looking good. And actually this spline, this whole capsule little sweep thing is kind of in the way. So it's kind of in the way of actually seeing the letter. So I'm just going to move this over. You can actually see the letter a little bit better. Round out these curves again. There we go. Another thing I can do is just, maybe I'll just shrink this part. So you can, that way you can see a little bit more of the letter. And again, just want to smooth this out. There we go. All right, so this is looking good. We have our spline wrapped around it with our swept or our wrapped capsules. So now we can actually go ahead and start lighting and texturing this guy and start lighting it with the actual spline that we're using for the spline wrap. So again, I can go into this light, use this spline, and let's turn on interactive render region here. And you'll see that I have a pink light or a pink color for our light here. That's all well and good, but it's very dark still. So what we can do is go ahead and crank up the intensity And you'll see that with our spline, we're actually lighting the letter N with our spline. So it almost looks like these little this little swept capsules are the light source. So what we can do to control this even better is add a fall off. And from my experience, the thing that works best as the light source is linear, not inverse square, which is what you typically use in the most physically accurate. But this linear gives you a little bit less issues as far as sampling and stuff like that. And we'll run into a little sampling issue here soon enough. But now you can actually control the radius and the inner radius. And basically what this is doing is really it's just multiplying and cloning lights, tiny lights along the spline. And that's how it's basically lighting our scene right now. So let's go ahead and let's start adjusting some stuff here. So right now, we can control how much this is getting lit by adjusting our specular. So I can crank up the strength here. And this is basically going to control how much our light's going to be lighting our objects. So we can really crank this up here. Make it not light it as much. And really increase the specular strength to make that really get blown out here. And we can even adjust the color here. Let's see, where I mentioned that this is basically like cloning tiny lights along our spline. Basically, that's what you're seeing in our reflection here. So we can fix this by going into our light, going into our details, and you can see the samples here. So the samples is how many of these like cloned lights are kind of basically being projected or cloned onto whatever object or spline you have in this object field. So what I can do is just crank this up, really crank up the samples. You can see that our render is still pretty hefty. So just like I said, like this is a really good, like cloning tiny lights along our spline. Basically, that's what you're seeing in our reflection here. So we can fix this by going into our light, going into our details, and you can see the samples here. So the samples is how many of these like cloned lights are kind of basically being projected or cloned onto whatever object or spline you have in this object field. So what I can do is just crank this up, really crank up the samples. You can see that our render is still pretty hefty. So just like I said, like this is a really good replacement for GI. So I can go up to like 500 samples and that smooths everything out. You can see our render is getting a little bit slower, but this is way, way, way faster than GI, right? So, we can, so to get around that without going to the samples, you can just not use a very sharp highlight, specular highlight. So let's go ahead and, so we've textured our, you can see right here, if it's a very sharp highlight and it's a big one, you can start to see a bunch of circles showing up. Let's do that again so I can show you. So you can see a bunch of circles in here. So that's just something to keep in mind. But the workaround is to just not have sharp highlights. And if you do have sharp highlights, to really crank up the samples. So we can go in here and let's say we don't want to light our scene with, or at least colors wise, we don't want to have the color be chosen by the color here by the light. What we can do is actually color our objects with our specular color. So I can go in here and say, let's make this, so our original one was kind of this bluish, tealish kind of thing. So we have a white light, but we have some blue in our specular. Let's put some blue in our reflection. So even though our light's lighting the scene, we're actually controlling the color of the light as it's affecting our objects by our reflection and our specular. So I can crank this up pretty high. Crank up this specular. Let's even let's add some Fresnel to our reflection here, because that reflection is a little hot. Now you can start to see a little bit of that splotching. So we can again go back into our details, and this goes all the way up to 1,000. And you can see that when you go to 1,000, it smooths everything out, but it's also taking a little bit of a hit on our render. So we can kind of work between the two and bring that down to 500, maybe not have such a hot specular. So we can go something like that. So, and you can also control how much of your object is being seen by adjusting the actual color of your object. So if it's black, you can see that only areas where that spline is really going to get that light. And again, you can also control it by how wide your specular is. So what we can do is double up on the specular and get some really cool effects. So let's add a Fong, and let's just turn the reflection strength down. Just want a very hot specular here, just a little bit of strength. And you can see right here, this is the issue that I was talking about, where we got some little bit of issues going on here, but if we adjust the roughness, it kind of blurs everything out. And we also need to have this be additive, so it adds on to our specular underneath. Let's actually use a different kind of specular. Let's go and use the old school Fong. And I just want like a sharp specular highlight that's white. And actually uses the color, the white color of the light. Bring it in here. So now we have the blue highlight, and we also have like a little bit of a white highlight here that's very subtle. It's there. Or we can make this a totally different color too. We can make this maybe a little magenta-y. Totally a word. So now we can get different colors that's being cast onto our, or at least being represented in the specular. And again, we can do that same thing with changing the color of our reflection. So a lot of this is, the way we're doing it right now is coloring it based on not the light color, but the reflection and the specular here. So we can kind of get these really cool effects. So we can go back into our light, and right now it's fairly dark. So let's crank up the radius or the decay and really start lighting more of this object. You can also go and really crank up the intensity. So again, with a spline, there's going to be no difference in showing this in render or not. So just keep that in mind, because there is nothing to render, because a spline isn't a visible thing unless you actually put like put a hair material on it or something like that. Let's go ahead and let's duplicate this texture, and let's just apply this to our little capsule sweep thingamajig we got going on. Increase the height segments a little bit just to smooth it out. So a little bit of chunky geometry going on. So I'm just going to apply the material, apply that same material onto our capsules, and I'll just rename this capsule. So now we can go ahead and change the color of these capsules. So again, we have this really cool, like bluish, purplish thing, and the scene's all being lit by our spline. So we can actually see right here that we're not seeing the bottom part of this N. So we can, if we want to do this, we can maybe make this N part of the spline kind of go down here. And by doing this, we're actually going to get that spline to light that bottom part of the N. So as this renders, we can now see the bottom part of our N being lit. Cool. So let's just kind of round stuff out here. I could tweak splines forever. I'm sorry. I'm a spline perfectionist. I'll cop to that. All right, so there is our lit N. Let's actually change the color. So we got the blue. Let's do more pinkish for the capsules. Even though I like this kind of iridescent kind of look. So this is the capsule. Let's go in here. The specular, let's change this to like a hot pink as well. Now I got this really cool looking effect. And again, this is all being lit by light. And again, I really want to hit home on the fact that this renders so dang fast for being like really like a GI kind of effect. And again, we can see a little bit in here, some of those individual lights. Let's actually go into our spline. I just want to smooth everything out by bringing down the angle to 0. So now it's a very smooth spline. And that's not really going to change anything with the light there. But we can go and kind of see if 750, move it up from 500. So you can see it's smoothing out. I'm seeing a little bit of the kind of splotchiness happening right here, right at the bottom. We bring down the quality here a little bit so it renders a bit faster for you guys. All right, so again, so it's kind of a give and take. You can adjust the samples, or you can adjust, the specular here, because this is basically gonna like blur your the little lights from showing up, the little individual light spheres showing up in the render. You can also adjust like the brightness of the specular as well. So you can just tweak back and forth how you want this to look. So let's go back to our capsule. So we got this really cool pink stuff going on. I'll just increase the width of our specular so we can get a little bit more light. And one cool thing this is a little bonus, little bonus tip for you guys. There's a really cool effect that let's actually put into diffusion called the backlight. What the backlight's going to do is make it look like and if I affect the luminance and reflection here, it's going to almost make it look like it's being lit from behind. You can kind of see a little bit. It actually looks a little better if we actually have some color in here. Let's just go into this backlight and let's change this window to a sphere. Basically, you can see that it looks like it's getting lit from behind. So it's very aptly named the backlight. But sometimes it adds some really cool effects when, basically if this whole capsule mesh wrap thing is acting like the light source, this kind of helps sell that effect even more. You can use that or not, but I think it adds a really nice cool effect there in the diffusion channel. Let's go to reflection. So our reflection, do we have some for now? Yep. Let's bring that down a little bit. Let's get a little bit more reflection. And let's actually, right now we're not really reflecting anything in our scene because we have no HDRIs or anything like that. So let's go ahead and grab our handy dandy HDRI Studio and turn off the floor and turn off the background. Don't need any of that stuff. We just want some sexy reflections in here. We can like blur the luminance texture and the reflect texture a little bit. And let's open up the browser and choose something like this bevel reflection. That should give us some nice cool highlights. Or even something like this, where we just don't want too much reflection, just little slices here and there. So again, we can also use other objects to, like we can bring in our ring light again if we want to. So we can, so this is the spline light. Let's duplicate this, and I can spell light, L-I. There we go. The spline light, and this is our torus. So again, stinks that there's no torus in here, but we can create one, and let's make a torus. Let's move it back. Let's face it positive Z. So there's our torus, our little ring light. And let's bring the pipe radius down a little bit. Bring up the ring segment, or actually the pipe segments, just so it's nice and round. And we can use this. Again, we need to make it editable. And now we can use that torus as the light, as a little ring light. Again, we can use a different color. Let's do like a purple, maybe. And one cool thing we can do is, say we don't want to see that in the reflection. So right now we're seeing it in the reflection. Let's just see it in the specular. So all you're going to do is use this as a light source, and you're not going to see it in the reflection. So it's almost like creating an object and putting a compositing tag on it. And we can probably bring down the samples a little bit. Now we can just go ahead, move this object around, maybe move it to the side here. And let's actually make another light with another torus. This torus right here. And we'll just move this over here. Now we got double the pleasure, double the fun, double ring light. And then we can change the color of this ring light to like that color, yellow. And bring down the intensity. We're getting crazy now. Bring down the intensity a little bit. We get really cool lighting effects. And this is looking super neon right now. Super neon. But one thing I did in my original one is I just placed some clone cubes in the background just to add some nice accents. So let's go ahead and do that really quick. So that's actually, this is all fun and good. This is a little bit too crazy. Too much going on. I'm just going to delete those other lights. And I just really want to hit home the fact of you can create really nice lighting effects just with a single spline. So again, let's go ahead. Let's get a camera in here. Let's look through it. And let's make this an extreme angle. So maybe like 30 to 50. So we get some really nice depth perspective here, some force perspective. And then we can make our let's make our cube, big cube, make it a fillet. So we got some nice round edges there to reflect some stuff off of. Let's apply our material to the cube. Let's push this back. Let's make this a little smaller, tall, and clone it. Cloning it. We're going to bring a cloner, put the cube in there. Crank the count up, and we want it to clone to positive X. Move this all the way out. And get out of here, Facebook. And push this back. Right now it's like intersecting our letter. And let's just rotate We see right now we're at an angle. So we angled at 45 degrees. So now we can actually adjust the X a little bit more. Basically what you're seeing is we have this really nice textured background, basically. And right now, for my tastes, it's got way too much reflection and specular. I want it to be very subtle, just like it is right here. So the thing I'm going to do is, again, really drive home the control of how much light goes on your object by adjusting the specular. So this will be our background. So let me just go ahead, put a new material on that. And what I'm going to do is, number one, let's find a reflection. Let's bring our reflection down. Our specular, let's make this pretty sharp and not as strong. And maybe even lighten this up a little bit. And then this specular we're going to bring down as well. So this is just going to be a very subtle background. Let's actually change this background color to this magenta or this hot pink kind of dealy. Now it's just going to be a very subtle background element. See what this looks like here. So as this is rendering, we can see a little bit of subtle stuff happening here in the background. Especially here. That's actually probably too much specular going on, but you can always bring down the brightness there. Everything's controlled by this one spline light. And crank this up. You can also crank up the radius. Make this really light even more stuff in the scene. This reminds me of like the Netscape logo, actually, now that I look at this a lot more. I had the N with the little swoosh, right? Here we go. So with more objects in our scene, with more reflections, now we're starting to see stuff slow down a little bit, but we also have a whole bunch of samples. But you can see how just lighting this scene with one spline really gets this really nice effect, especially if you have a fairly dark scene where just your spline is lighting this object. Now to do this any other way with like GI or anything like that, that again we're talking about. Actually, I just brought the samples down quite low, and that actually looks kind of cool. So when you bring the samples down, that was a happy accident. Again, it's like you're cloning individual lights along here. So what I was going to say is you can do GI lights, but again, you're going to get that render hit that a GI, adding GI to your scene does, or you would have to manually place lights on this object. And what I've actually done plenty of times for like sports or like movie titles or stuff where you have very specific areas where a light hits, just to get these really nice light accents. So really I did that. You can do that with just bringing the samples down and just have a light show up here, light show up back here and back here, just because there's only 16 samples showing up along the spline, as opposed to, you know, the 500 that'll show up now and actually look like a solid light source. So using objects as light, this is just like skimming the surface of some cool stuff you can do. So I use toruses as ring lights. There's so many other cool things you can do. One thing I was gonna make was the ghost from Pac-Man and have that as a light source. And again, you're basically, when you use this method, you're getting rid of the GI, so you get really fast renders. But again, your limitations are the samples. You can only crank that to 1,000. So if it doesn't look good with 1,000 samples, You got to add the grain, which even the option says is slow. So when an option says it's slow, it's going to be pretty dang slow. So I would not do that. So yeah, that's it. That is objects as lights. Hopefully this, kind of made you think about things a little bit differently and how you approach projects, and maybe this kind of get your creative juices flowing for some cool stuff. And just lighting things very creatively. But if you have any questions, let me know. Post them in the comments. If you make anything with using objects as lights or splines as lights or anything cool, you make a Netscape logo like I did, be sure to share. I'd love to see it. But thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you in another tutorial. Bye, everybody.